Good morning, everyone. We will begin the webinar in a few minutes as we get our panelists and attendees in here. Okay. Morning, Derek.
I'm in the right place, right?
Yep, you're here. Just
Okay.
Getting Justin in here as well.
Just want to make sure I didn't join some.
Nope, you're good. I was having some technical issues.
Nope, no problem.
All righty. Perfect. Okay. Morning, Justin.
Fix the hair. Okay.
Perfect. Okay. And then let me see our attendees. All right. Yeah, looks like we got the majority of folks in here. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar this morning. We are excited to kick off another great CE presentation for you today by our panelists, Derek and Justin. Before I turn it over to them, for those of you who are joining for the first time, we will have the first half of the webinar be the presentation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A after that. In the Zoom meeting webinar here, you'll see the Q&A tab at the bottom. Feel free to drop your questions in there. You can also view other people's questions, upvote and comment, move their questions up in the queue, and then we'll kind of walk through the queue as well. After this webinar, you will get a survey right after to just put in your information as far as your CFP ID and things like that, so we can make sure you get credit for your CFP CE credit for joining this webinar. Okay, all right, guys, I will turn it over to you and come back for the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending. So today we're going to be talking about risk in retirement and how to adjust for risk over time, because it's very clear, whether that's based on research or your own intuitions about your clients or people that retirees don't fail in retirement. So they don't typically kind of run off the cliff, Wile E. Coyote style, and run out of money. Instead, they adjust. And this is really similar to how we might adjust in our working years. Things are a little better than expected. We take that nice vacation. Things are worse than expected. Maybe we trim back a little bit. So this is very clear. And before we kind of get into the ways that people can adjust and ways to really scale this across client types and across time for the same client, I want to just take a second to talk about what this means for how we discuss retirement and retirement risk for clients. And we often do this with metaphors, right? So there's a lot of kinds of risk in the world. Some's catastrophic, some is chronic, some is small, some is large. And unfortunately, the kind of dominant paradigm for discussing retirement and retirement risk right now is the success and failure paradigm, right? This kind of binary, black and white, you either succeed or you fail. And a lot of people have talked about why this paradigm is not adequate for discussing retirement. However, you will see people say things like, well, would you get on an airplane if it had a 10% chance of crashing, if it only had a 90% chance of success? But that's really the wrong metaphor for retirement. Retirement is very different than flying a plane. We might look for metaphors more in the realm of detours or fender benders or traffic jams. Maybe even if you want to stick with planes, we might stick with delays or even cancellations, right? Things that are definitely annoying and depending on the situation, even really a problem, but definitely not the same as catastrophic failure. And the reason for that is that retirement has some really helpful characteristics. I've said before that retirees have a superpower, and it's based on the way that retirement lays itself out over time. So from the financial standpoint, at least, the liabilities of retirement they're small. They're small relative to the whole, and they're spread out over time relatively smoothly. That means that as things change in the world around us for a particular retiree, we will see how risk is changing, right? So it will either be going up or going down or maybe staying the same, but it will tend to move, not all at once. It won't go from, hey, everything was amazing. We were underspending. We were probably going to leave lots of extra money to our heirs. And then the next day, it's the opposite. Instead, things move over time, generally over months or maybe even years. At the very worst, over many weeks, we might see, hey, things were really good. Now we're just normal again, right? And the great thing, the superpower of this is we can both see how things are changing over time for retirees, and we can make changes in advance to adjust for those. So the liabilities themselves are often flexible. So I've talked before about how this is very different from a hedge fund or something. Maybe it's a highly leveraged hedge fund, mark to market, futures or securities. And there, you really could go from things are okay to you're out of business, the next day or the next week. That's not the way it typically happens with retirees. Okay, with that kind of groundwork in place, what we would look for in an income adjustment kind of paradigm would just be something that is tracking that risk and letting us know if risk is too low, so to speak, right? Allowing us to let clients know, hey, you can afford to live a little right now, maybe take that vacation you've been hoping to do, or do that home improvement project, right? There's some slack for you can take up here. Or is risk getting too high? Consider tightening the belts. So that's kind of the paradigm we're looking for, a way to do that, right? And ideally, this would be an approach to adjustments in retirement that are accurate. So we want, our analytics to give us adjustments in the right direction. That's first and foremost, of the right size, so to speak, although that's a little bit, that might depend on the client, what the right size is, and at the right time. We want it to be scalable. So we want it to apply across all different client types, different mixes of income sources and so on. And over time, it should apply for a 60-year-old, a 70-year-old, an 80-year-old, right? It should scale. We want this to also give us something that we can communicate in an understandable way so that clients and advisors know what to expect, right? A way that you can really, communicate this and be understood. And then we want it to be manageable, right? This can't be something that where now you can only have one client because it's so complex that you're going to need to spend all the time on the analytics there. So adjustment-based planning in retirement is nothing new. In fact, even in Bill Bengen's 1994 piece on what many people later called the 4% rule, he talked about adjusting toward the end of that article. So people have known that adjustments should be part of retirement for a very long time. And there are lots of different approaches you can find in the academic literature and the practitioner literature on how you might go about it in kind of the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts of, doing the calculations for figuring out when to suggest that your clients make adjustments. And the approach is that that I'll talk about today, and one in particular, you could kind of say are built in this kind of mode of triggers or guardrails, right? So triggers might be something like, is my portfolio balance up or down by a certain amount? Is my withdrawal rate too high or too low? Or there are even cases where it simply has a certain amount of time passed. Is it time to update my withdrawal rate? And then the adjustments, once something is triggered, once a guardrail is hit, tend to be increased or decreased by something. Maybe there's a floor or a ceiling on a withdrawal rate or an amount. Or there are some cases where you might see something like, hey, if our account balance is down by a certain amount, skip an inflation adjustment, that kind of thing. So triggers for adjustment, and then the adjustments themselves. Now, a lot of these approaches have some value to them, particularly as research topics, because they tend to strip away a lot of the complexity of typical client situations and kind of give us an insight right into the analytics of it. Some of them seem fairly easy to manage. For example, skipping an inflation adjustment is very simple. We just do nothing. They tend to have an intuitive link to risk, which is definitely a virtue here. And there's a lot of research on them. But unfortunately, when you try to transfer them into, the messy world of client idiosyncrasies and things, you can run into trouble. So we'll see how these can even trigger adjustments in the wrong direction in certain times. So, but the main thing is it's really not easy to scale these across realistic client situations. So we'll give an example here. So probably one of the more well-studied and definitely more widely adopted approaches to giving retirement income adjustment advice is to use withdrawal rate guardrails. Lots of approaches to this as well. But what this means is you're going to target a certain withdrawal from an investment portfolio and take systematic withdrawals. So you're going to keep that dollar amount withdrawal in place, making inflation adjustments over time, and then change that dollar amount only if something else happens. Okay, so if I'm taking $50,000 from $1 million portfolio, that's a 5% withdrawal rate. If the portfolio balance goes up, the withdrawal rate will go down. If the portfolio balance goes down, the withdrawal rate will go up, right? So let's imagine something like this. I'm going to target 4.7% withdrawal. So that $1 million account would give us $47,000 a year. However, if that withdrawal, that $47,000, ever hits 6%, right? So now my portfolio balance is down enough that the withdrawal rate is up. I will reduce my income, right? Presumably in this case, back to 4.7. However, if the withdrawal rate hits 4%, so the account balance is up enough that the $47,000 withdrawal is now 4% of the portfolio instead of 4.7, I will increase my income. Again, probably back to 4.7. Now, nice things about this, it's fairly easy to track, right? We just need a calculator. So it's easy to calculate. And there's an intuitive link to risk. It's clearly less risky to take $47,000 from a $1.5 million portfolio than it would be to take it from an $800,000 portfolio, right? I mean, that's just entirely obvious, right? And so the guardrails and the adjustments have an intuitive link to that risk that we saw earlier, which is, hey, if risk is down a certain amount, I want to be able to let my clients know. And if risk is up, I want to be able to let them know and that it's time to make a change. The problem is this can seem to work okay for kind of a simple plan that just has portfolio withdrawals. We'll actually see that even in this case, it actually doesn't scale across time. But if this were the kind of plan that we were always doing, at least at the beginning of the plan, it might have some legs for a short amount of time. The problem is we want a system that will scale all the way to fully complex, more realistic income plans like this one that has a couple of Social Security income flows, some portfolio withdrawals. It has the retirement smile And you can see the shape of the planned portfolio withdrawals is anything but constant. And so we're going to see this is a big problem for something like withdrawal rate guardrails. The first problem has to do with how the risk of a particular withdrawal rate changes over time. So this is actually a problem even for that simple plan with just flat inflation adjusted portfolio withdrawals. So what happens as we age, as clients age, is that the length of a plan will go down, right? Even if we keep longevity risk the same. So let's think of longevity risk as the risk that you live past your planned horizon. So if it's a single individual, you could maybe have some life expectancy numbers. If it's joint, it would be the chance that at least one person lives past that joint life expectancy. But regardless, if we keep longevity risk constant, then this kind of darker blue line that starts up on the left around between 30 and 35. So that's the joint life expectancy. Sorry, not life expectancy, but it's the plan length. If you were planning for, I believe I grabbed these numbers as a basically a 30% chance that somebody lives longer than that, right? So that's your longevity risk here is 30% chance somebody goes longer than that. But over time, if I keep that 30% risk the same, of course, as these individuals age, the plan length would come down. Now it's not one for one. If we live a year, we lose slightly less than a year in life expectancy. So we get credit for having survived that year, right? But as this comes down, we have less and less time that we have to fund. That means that the withdrawal rates that are available at any particular risk level, or sticking to the success and failure paradigm, success rate, those are going to go up, right? Again, this is fairly intuitive, right? And so we can see if all risk were kept the same, longevity risk and success and failure estimates, the withdrawal rates that we can actually afford would be going up over time, no matter what risk level we chose. And so we can see why this would be a problem for withdrawal rate guardrails. It's great that withdrawal rate guardrails have an intuitive link to risk, but the actual values, if we wanted to keep that link to risk, would have to change over time, right? So we can't apply static withdrawal rate guardrails in a world where risk, where the amounts available actually are changing, even if we kept risk the same. All right, so that kind of dummy example I had earlier of 4.7 is the middle, and then 4 and 6 are the guardrails. If we superimpose that on these rising withdrawal rates, we see that let's imagine we started at the green line here, right, just under 5%. Well, by the time I'm, let's call it 66, 67, even if everything had stayed the same, if I were taking that 47,000 and now we're a 6% withdrawal, that withdrawal rate plan would be asking me to take a pay cut, when in fact nothing has changed for me risk-wise. I have exactly the same risk as when I began the plan, right? And so and you could even imagine a situation where this would be triggering a reduction when in fact my risk has gone down, right? Maybe I'm 68, 69. Now I actually could have a pay raise, but it would be asking me for a pay cut, right? So by ignoring this, the way that risk and withdrawals and life expectancy interact as a plan proceeds, the kind of static withdrawal rate guardrails would really do a disservice to this client. But of course, it gets worse. So often a plan will have planned changes in spending, which would translate into planned changes in withdrawal rates over time. So this is kind of a familiar picture of the retirement smile. reflects the idea that people would spend more early in their retirement when they're typically younger, healthier, more active, but that on an inflation adjusted basis, that spending would come down over time, and then potentially tick up at the end of the plan. And this can be very attractive to people, both because it does reflect what is intuitively kind of a normal life cycle, but also because it provides more income available toward the beginning of the plan when you need it the most. So it can make assets and resources go farther for a particular client, or it could bring risk down. Basically, you'll see here that typically it's 15 to 20% more income toward the beginning of retirement is available if somebody plans with the retirement smile. So very attractive. However, we would now be in a position where we can't track withdrawal rates and know whether a change in withdrawal rate over time was planned or unplanned. And we only would want to react to changes that are unplanned, changes where things have gone worse than expected or better than expected. So an example is here: if I began withdrawing $174,000 a year at the beginning, but in about 10 years, I'm planning to have $150,000 in today's dollars. I wouldn't know, 10, 11 years from now, let's say my balance has gone from 3 million to 3.8 million. Would I, given that my rate is now 3.9%, would I then get a pay raise because it's under 4? Or is that was the original plan anyway, so we shouldn't make an adjustment? In order for this to work, we would need to know at every single point in the plan what the guardrails are. So in this case, I plan for higher income because the retirement smile gives me that, right? So now I have a target of 5.7%. I'm supposed to increase it at 4.3 and decrease it at 7. So I kind of raised all of the guardrails and things a little bit, but it's still not clear to me what I should do here, right? Is this a time where I should leave everything the same, or is it a place where I should adjust? In order to know that, we would need an incredibly complex set of tables of withdrawal rates. And of course, it gets even worse because I would need a different set for every possible combination of ages and portfolio balances or portfolio allocations and fees and longevity goals and plan lengths and so on. But what truly makes it unworkable is this pattern that we often see with retirees who retire maybe in their late 50s, early 60s, even mid 60s, and are delaying Social Security. So in this situation, think of this as like a swimming pool with a deep end and a shallow end. Now this one happens to have a drop off, right? Well, we have to fill in the deep end of the swimming pool with portfolio withdrawals, with water, right? But it's going to be shallower once we get to later in the retirement. And so here, focusing on withdrawal rates is again going to be very difficult, right? At the beginning, we're taking $67,000 a year. One Social Security kicks in, Mary's here. Then we're going to drop our withdrawals to $55,000. John's Social Security starts, we're down to $24,000. We have the retirement smile superimposed on top, so much so that 24 years from now, we're actually planning for $10,500 in withdrawals. So this shows how a focus on withdrawal rates, although it's really useful for research purposes, we really need to step away from it when it comes to realistic client situations. In fact, it's even beyond, showing how withdrawal rate guardrails are unworkable for a situation like this. Often, maybe clients have read articles about what a safe withdrawal rate is, and so they'll wonder what the plan's withdrawal rate is. Unfortunately, this is exactly the kind of situation where we might have to kind of walk them back from that sort of a focus, right? Because maybe if they have $1 million, let's say, it would look like a 6.7% withdrawal rate here. And it is at the beginning. But that's really, we don't want clients to fixate on the withdrawal rate because it's not representative of the plan's risk overall, right? It's going to be, we're planning for the sources of income to change over time. And so that's It's just, that's not a piece of data that's going to be very useful in this plan. Okay, so what's the solution to this? The solution is to base the income adjustment plan on the concept of income risk, right? So what I said earlier, some of the really nice things about some of the more, quote unquote, traditional approaches to dynamic income planning. Strange to call them traditional since they've only been around for maybe, 20 years at the most. But one of the nice things about them is they tend to have an intuitive link to risk, at least when you're looking at a simplified plan, one that's only being funded by portfolio withdrawals, for example. So we don't want to lose that. That's the key. The key is that we want to react to changes in risk when the risk has gone far enough in one or the other direction that it would be prudent for the client to make an adjustment and that it would be worthwhile. So what is income risk? It's simply the chances that the current planned income or spending will not be sustainable without adjustment in the future. Now, probably a lot of you have already realized, well, that's just, basically probability of failure, right? But, Derek and I have talked elsewhere and many times about how that particular framing is really a problem. I also talked at the beginning of this webinar about that. So I think kind of abstracting from it and saying, hey, how risky is our current kind of income behavior, spending behavior? That's income risk. And it's a combination of everything. It's a combination of non-portfolio income sources and characteristics, things like the timing of Social Security or the inflation treatment of a pension. It's a combination of things like portfolio balance, allocation, fees, spending and legacy goals come into play here. The length of the plan certainly comes into play here, right? So as an example, if nothing changed and I simply lived 10 years, but I was still taking the same income from the same portfolio balance, risk has gone down, right? We saw that earlier with how those withdrawal rate curves go up. So that's income risk, and we want to base our income adjustment plan on that. So the structure of a risk-based retirement adjustment plan would have kind of a target risk level. And because this is a dynamic plan, one where you'll adjust before you, even get to the cliff's edge, let alone run off it, typically we'll see people explore plans that do have a risk above zero, right? Something greater than, estimated no chance that you'll have to adjust down. So maybe it's, now there are people where that's appropriate, right? Either they're particularly risk averse or they just don't need as much spending. So another nice thing about this kind of paradigm is there's really no right answer for everyone about what the right adjustment plan is for them. But the example here is, let's say, maybe we target a risk of 20. If that risk ever comes down to zero, meaning now we're predicting that if you kept doing what you're doing, you'll never have to adjust, right? So you have a huge buffer in your risk. Then we'll raise income, raise spending. In practice, that might be, you can take that vacation, you can do that project, or it might be, live a little, go out to a few more meals, buy the nicer wine, whatever it is. And if risk goes up enough, then we will counsel tightening the belt. So in this case, let's say that, risk goes from 20 to 70, right? Now there's a 70% chance this isn't going to work out without an adjustment. Still a chance you could make it, right? But at some point, risk will have gone up enough that you'll say, well, I'm going to go ahead and make an adjustment now. Even though it's not a sure thing I'll need to, I'm going to make an adjustment now. And so that's what this would be. And then the change could be all sorts of things, but clearly you're moving. If risk is high, you're trying to move your risk lower. If risk is low, you're moving your risk a little higher. And then what we want from this is a possible kind of a landscape that clients would move through that keeps their income kind of in a reasonable range for them, right? So maybe it's a range where income never goes below a certain kind of floor, a level of essential expenses that they have figured out, right? So we want to always want to kind of balance the goals of standard of living and legal and experience goals, risk tolerance goals, to provide these income experiences. And so you'll see here, this is just an example with, I guess, 6 different possible ways that income could go for a dynamic plan. You see, some stair steps up, a few stair steps down. Those are the income adjustments up or down over time. So one of the things that I said we would want out of a scalable, robust approach to income adjustment planning would be that we could communicate it well and it would be understandable to clients. So the process to getting there is we would estimate risk holistically in this way that I just laid out, right? Put everything about the plan, all of its special features together and estimate risk. We would target an income plan that fits the household's risk preferences. So again, there might be people who say, look, I never want a call from you that says it's time to tighten my belt. Now, you can't guarantee them that, but you can say, well, then we'll plan to really minimize that likelihood, right? Or, and by the way, what that will mean for them is they'll have to spend less now, right? Or it might be someone who says, look, I'm young, I want to live a little, I can absorb a reduction in my spending in the future if I really need to, but let's go for it. So you want to target an income plan that fits them. And then you want to build contingency plans, the guardrails that are also comfortable for them. So again, somebody who's more risk averse might want that guardrail that says it's time to adjust down. They might want that guardrail to be pretty far away, right? And there are ways to do that. So basically allowing risk to go to have a big buffer before risk is high enough that they would have to adjust. And then we want to monitor this plan regularly. And then we would communicate the plan as much as possible in dollar terms. So there's all sorts of analytics going on down here. We're estimating risk, there are probabilities and things involved, but we want to communicate in a way that sets the expectations in an understandable way. So for example, here we have a $2.2 million portfolio. Their particular target income level, their risk level, puts them at taking $14,000 of income per month. They're going to pay some taxes in that. They're going to spend money out of that. And by the way, this income word, it's total income, right? It could be a mix of all sorts of things, not just portfolio withdrawals, right? So we don't want to immediately have people, divide 14,000 by 2.2 million and get their withdrawal rate. It's not, right? There are other income sources in here. It could be a rental property, certainly some social securities and so on. And then most importantly, we want to set expectations about what could make this, this income level change. And so here we see the income adjustment plan, where if the balance goes up by 5%, they would be allowed to spend more. If it went down by 20%, they would have to tighten their belt. And crucially, you will see these income guardrails change based on the plan. For example, if a plan is heavily funded by Social Security and where portfolio withdrawals are playing a much smaller role, you might see a much larger gap toward the income decrease, right? It might be a 30 or 40% decrease needed for an income adjustment down because Social Security is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. On the other hand, if you have much more of your portfolio or your retirement income is being funded by portfolio withdrawals, you might see those guardrails be a little bit closer. This is also, the advisor would have total control over what exactly these guardrails are, right? So if increasing at a 5% increase in the portfolio seems a little too close, we'll just move the increase trigger a little farther away, right? Say, hey, I get it. Things would be going in a good direction if this happened, but we're going to wait a little longer until we take the increase. It's important, though, not just to set short-term expectations of, hey, what could cause over the next, let's call it, couple of years, a change in our income, a change in our spending, but also kind of a longer term view, right? Because obviously a plan could have more than one adjustment over time. At the very least, we would expect to have multiple inflation adjustments over time, right? But we probably would have more than one kind of risk-based adjustment as well. So what kind of could the whole income experience look like if following a dynamic plan of this sort, a risk-based plan? And so this is another way to kind of set those expectations, more long-term expectations for clients. So here, what we do at Income Lab is we simulate this plan playing out over the full length of the plan, taking income adjustments when the plan calls for it, right? Raises when it calls for it, and pay cuts when it calls for it. And then we just say, hey, overall, compared to what we had originally planned, how often did I get more than expected? How often did I get less than expected? In this case, this is a relatively conservative plan. So 88% of the scenarios up with total lifetime income above plan. On average, 26% more, right? So, a nice set of income increases over time. But clients will often want to focus on the downside, which is fair enough, right? That might be kind of their risk aversion coming into play. And there were scenarios, in this case, 12% of them, that ended up with less than expected overall. But on average, it was only 3% less, which, depending on the plan in the household, that may or may not be something that they would notice. 12% below, that probably would be something they would notice. But crucially, this is a place where we can kind of, paint a picture that shows, hey, even, our estimate of a really bad scenario is not total financial ruin, right? This is something that we, could maybe absorb. And if it's not something that a household feels they could absorb, and you think, kind of the very tail end, the worst case scenario is something that's worth looking at, that's a time to go back to the plan and maybe make it a little more conservative. We don't just want that overall picture, though. We also want to be able to set expectations of kind of what this could feel like in terms of adjustments. How often might I see an adjustment, right? So the cadence, and how large could these be? Now, this is a wide range of simulations, so we get some pretty wild stuff in here. But on average, they're seeing an increase every 1.2 years for this plan. Right now, this includes inflation adjustments, right? So this is really helping clients understand, hey, how often, in my annual meeting, or how often am I getting a phone call saying, hey, we're recommending you make an adjustment. It also gives us a range, the 90th percentile is probably the best thing to look at here, of, okay, normally that's between 5 and 10% on the upside, between 0 and 8.3 on the downside. And you'll notice that the downside adjustments are much less common. Although if there are downside adjustments, you may tend to see a few in a row, right? Maybe it's a 2008 situation or something like that. Okay, so let's kind of summarize the view of these total risk guardrails. They are actually easy to communicate if we abstract away from the hardcore analytics and just focus on dollars and a few other ways to kind of paint the picture, set the expectations. Most crucially, it handles the complexity of real life, of different income sources, of the fact that we age and our longevity expectations will change. It is a way to track all of the interrelated parts of the plan. It allows us to keep communication at that higher level of abstraction because, risk is the point of even those kind of more traditional approaches to retirement income planning with adjustments. And maybe most importantly, it actually scales across clients and across time. So different types of clients, totally funded by portfolio withdrawals, barely funded by portfolio withdrawals, with the retirement smile, without the retirement smile, delaying Social Security, not delaying Social Security. All of that is easily handled in this kind of a paradigm, and crucially across time. So as we kind of live, okay, first we're taking portfolio withdrawals, then Social Security starts. That will have caused a change in the risk profile, right? They've gone from kind of somebody who had fairly high portfolio withdrawals, so maybe more sequence of return risk, to someone who's now planning for lower portfolio withdrawals, lower sequence of return risk. So it's scaling across time for the same client as well. So that's kind of an overview. I think Derek, I know you use this with clients. If you have any any comments on how this has played out for you, love to hear them.
Yeah. So for me, really, when you're meeting with that client who's pre-retirement or in retirement, I think there's so much confusion around income and how do you generate it and all that. And I've actually found it kind of interesting. I was thinking as we were going through this today that for a number of people, I mean, talking in terms of income, just total income, this is how much you actually get to take home. Here's the guardrails. It's actually so much simpler than so much of the stuff that's out there that actually some prospects that have come to me and tried to do a little bit of their own homework, like sometimes I have to even kind of step them back because they're like, well, trying to compute the withdrawal rate and things like that from the portfolio, but showing them no, you actually show a visualization of here's how your portfolio withdrawal rate is going to change if you want to kind of achieve this constant level of spending for our retirement and smooth that out. So at the end of the day, I do think it's a really powerful way to show that. It has been just in some ways so much simpler than everything that everybody's trying to do and compare it to probability of success. And there's just these withdrawal rates when you're not accounting for what's happening in the rest of the income picture. That there has been some additional kind of just coaching somebody to, it really is as simple as that. And that's where I like to keep my focus, because getting lost in the analytics and the weeds of it, that's over the head of at least 95% of my clients. Not a very, very useful way to spend our time. And I'd rather just talk about, here's a good strategy for you. Look at the long-term metrics. Is somebody on that path? Make sure we get the long-term strategy right, but then managing the guardrails. And now it's time for an increase or decrease, and keep the conversation that simple.
All right, I think we've got a little bit of time for questions. Looks like we've got quite a few, so Malcolm.
Got quite a few. I'll start walking through them. First one here is kind of around the asymmetry of the guardrails. The user noticed in one of the slides, so 4.7% withdrawal rate, 6 and 4% guardrails means the top guardrail is 1.3% higher and the 4% guardrail is 0.7% lower. This is asymmetrical. Symmetrical guardrails would mean the same difference for the upper and lower guardrails. Can you just explain the logic behind kind of setting guardrails?
Yeah, so I would say, and I'm trying to find where my little example was. I think it was this one, right? So this was really just an example that I pulled out of thin air. So it wasn't necessarily something that I would have implemented, in an actual client situation. And as we saw, these withdrawal rate guardrails really are not something that you can apply over time. However, the asymmetry is definitely a thing. And so we see it here where the income decrease plan is much farther away, right? It's going to take more of a change to have an income decrease than it would to have an income increase. And that's simply by design here, right? So this would have been an advisor who thinks that asymmetry is reasonable for this client's risk profile. I would say that's typical. I don't know, Derek, what your thoughts are on there. It would take like a real, Spock, like Vulcan, purely rational person to say, no, I want to be right down the middle. I want a coin flip on whether I'll be increasing or decreasing. Again, maybe that person exists. That's fine.
Yeah, no, I do think it's when I'm working with clients, the focus of the clients tends to be much more on the downside, in my opinion. The upside is nice. It's great to be able to get an increase. But I even have clients that have told me they would take an increase if they got to it, or maybe if things change down the road. But right now they're like, I've got what I've got. I can't imagine living more or spending more, and I'll leave that to my kids or my family or charitable organizations. But I do think there is that asymmetry is normal. And again, just a note, like as Justin mentioned, you can go in and you can adjust that in the settings if you don't like the asymmetry that's there, don't think that fits well for the client situation.
Yep.
Yeah,
And
and
Derek,
we may have a question on this. Malcolm,
I was gonna say,
it's
Derek, you
submitted.
actually just answered the next question, which was, can we set the acceptable risk levels in the software?
Yeah, so if typically like the workflow would be, we define everything about the client, including their risk tolerance, longevity risk, and income risk tolerance, and we get this kind of first cut, right? And we say, okay, is that where we want the guardrails? I mean, both in terms of, well, is maybe 20%, that's a little too close. So I want to adjust the risk to give them a little more buffer. Or maybe 5% is too close. You say, look, we're not going to take a pay raise, next week when we have, by the way, actually Income Lab runs these monthly. So you do need, it's a monthly cadence. So it's not like we're checking every second to see if you're up 5%. But you might push that guardrail out. And in practice, what really happens when you hit these guardrails is it's a time when a conversation is going to be worthwhile, right? Because sometimes even on the downside, you might say, well, rather than taking a pay cut, we're going to take that $1 million legacy goal and drop it to 100,000 or something, right? I mean, there are other levers someone could pull in that situation.
Awesome.
Just
And
a
then,
quick note on that too. If somebody would want to get really precise, it's in the advanced settings that they would go into to adjust the guardrails, right? Just in blanking.
That's right. Yeah. In the income settings, there's a place where you can say, hey, customize income settings, and then, go wild.
and then next question here is, how does the software incorporate Social Security COLA increases?
Yeah. So for you, one thing we didn't talk about in the webinar, but you can set a plan to be monitored by the software. So we call that implementing a plan. And that means once a month, we're rerunning the plan and checking whether any guardrails have been hit, whether any inflation adjustments are necessary, and so on. All of that is, an advisor can set the thresholds for those, right? We're not going to make 0.1% inflation adjustments. And so in January, we will adjust the Social Security flows in the plan by that year's Social Security COLA. I think that's actually set to be announced in October. I've seen some fairly eye-popping numbers for this year. We'll see what actually happens, but it'll kind of do that automatically to make sure that we're keeping it on track.
And then next question here is, can you speak a bit about how the investment location affects the guardrails? For example, does having 20% of their assets in an annuity versus 100% in an IRA affect the results?
Yeah, so the interaction of taxes and guardrails is kind of interesting. In a way, like the guardrails don't care to some extent whether, let's say, you have a 60-40 portfolio in an IRA or in a taxable account, because the sequence of return risk would be very similar. I understand that there might be some kind of ongoing passive taxes in the taxable account. So the gross amount that you're withdrawing from your portfolio is the same. What really would matter there is the net spendable amount, right? And so there is this, retirement income planning is kind of incredibly complex. There is this really unfortunate place where really the risk of your withdrawals depends on your gross withdrawals, whereas the experience of your withdrawals depends on your net of tax withdrawals, right? So it's kind of a place where things don't match up exactly right. And this is a place where people will tend to do a little bit of, A/B testing on different approaches to distribution strategies, for example, whether you're taking from, taxable accounts first, tax deferred accounts first, and so on, to kind of zero in on a plan that works from a net perspective as well. But yeah, the risk tends to be focused on gross withdrawals. There is a setting in the software where you can say, well, hey, I want to define my net withdrawals. You tell me the gross withdrawals, tell me the risk profile of that. And so that's, if you're really focused on net withdrawals, that's the way to do it. Once you've figured out, okay, it looks like they can afford roughly, $10,000 a month, maybe solve for that income, and the software will gross up for taxes.
Awesome. And then next question here is, what if a client would rather adjust or increase their portfolio risk than reduce their income? How can you adjust that so that there's only enough additional exposure to keep income at equilibrium?
Yeah, that's another, these guardrails, hitting a guardrail is really a time to have a conversation, right? So if it's on the upside, someone might, like Derek said, they might say, well, look, I don't know what I would do. I mean, maybe they can find a one-off expense, right? But it's not that they're going to raise their total standard of living forever. So now maybe that's an opportunity to say, hey, I know you were, uncomfortable originally with this level of stock exposure. Actually, you could afford a little less stock exposure, right? So you can make an adjustment there, or vice versa, right? If you think it's prudent to increase stock exposure at some point, for example. So my example earlier was changing the legacy goals. You might change some spending goal, right? Maybe there's a particular spending goal that you had, like funding a grandkids' education or something like that, where that could be changed as well. So there are a lot of levers in a plan that can be used to adjust risk. The plan itself would be calling for changes in spending, changes in income as the lever to keep risk on track. But in practice, people are going to pull other levers as well.
And I think this question is kind of a follow-up saying to that point, Justin. It says, if a very risk-averse client couldn't handle the worst case downward adjustment, what is the best way to look at modifying the plan in a live meeting? So I think it's back to kind of those levers you mentioned as well.
Yeah, I think you'll need your bag of tricks on what kinds of things you believe are good to use for those kinds of clients. You can even right there just move the income setting slider, just move it to the more conservative side to get a quick, hey, let's instantly make a more conservative plan that'll reduce income, reduce guardrails, and so on. So I think if I were doing it in front of a client, that's probably the place I would go. There are, depending on your approach, there are ways to kind of put floors on income and so on. But that's probably, if I were live with a client, that's what I would do.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think live with the client, that's the most useful thing. But then also to note that you can go into the, when you're looking at the long-term income experience, and you can see, okay, we move this over, you're going to see the short-term guardrails, but I would also hop over to the long-term impact to see if this now fits better for what somebody could tolerate.
Yep.
And then this next one's interesting. It's how easily can an advisor track whether or not the client is following the guardrails advice?
So the way that Income Lab tracks guardrails is, people have asked us before, hey, do you track spending kind of in like a mint.com sort of way? And we don't. That would be a really cool feature, but what we'll see is, if you spent less than your plan, your portfolios will be higher than expected. If you spent more than your plan, your portfolios would be lower than expected. And that's really all that matters to this. So, for example, during the pandemic, probably a lot of people, canceled vacations, they went out less, so they just spent less. And so, a lot of people would have seen kind of risk going down. So their kind of situation getting more and more positive through that period, at least from a financial standpoint. And that would naturally have been captured if you were monitoring the plan. But, we're not, kind of tracking credit card spending and things like that.
And the next question here is more around kind of the taxes of the software. Is does the tax bracket management try to use all of the tax bracket, i.e. 20% each year, or does it try to average them as close to the 22% over time?
No, it's so bracket management is just trying, if there's space within the targeted bracket, which is one of the federal ordinary brackets, if there's any space left, once you've already had all of your income from pensions and Social Security and everything else, and then taken the withdrawals that you need to meet the plan, if there's still space within that federal ordinary bracket, it will figure out how much of a Roth conversion you could do and still be inside of that bracket. So that's that's the way it works. It's not trying to give you an average of that level. And really, it's not even saying, if there is no space in there, how could I have, gotten down to that level, right? It's only if there's, kind of a space left in the bucket.
Awesome. This another interesting question, but more again back to taxes is this advisor's notice, there's clearly some difference between Income Lab and Income Solver. Is there anything Income Solver does that you don't? For example, would you say your Roth conversion planning is as robust?
I'm not intimately familiar with Income Solver. I would say if you're seeing differences between Income Lab and any other planning related platform, could be a generalized platform or anything, often those differences are related to capital market assumptions, growth assumptions, inflation assumptions, all sorts of things that are important, very important, but are kind of superficial compared to the analytics themselves. So I don't know if anybody has other, if you have more experience with Income Solver. I know that they focus very, the point is to do tax planning. So I guess probably one of the biggest differences is that Income Lab is focused on dynamic adjustment-based planning as well.
Yeah, and if we have any users who have experience, or Derek, if you have experience, please share. If we have any users who do have experience with both, please share that in the chat as well for those people attending.
I was just going to quickly say, I don't have experience specifically with Income Solver, but in general, there are times when I'm using multiple software programs and I might compare the Roth recommendations between two, and I might say, so much to me, Roth conversion planning is as much art as it is science, and would the client even be willing to do whatever the software is recommending? Sometimes it's more aggressive. So I kind of like to sometimes even look at those different results. If they're different, try and figure out, is it the capital market assumptions what's driving that? But oftentimes, as Justin said, that's it. But it is sometimes helpful to kind of see it from multiple perspectives and make sure that it's aligning, or things aren't just totally out there, and then investigate further, see what might be driving that.
Yeah, and typically, like if you were using, so Income Lab's Tax Center is really, the goal is to help you build a long-term income plan, and hey, is this a better way to do taxes or not? We do have
Derek, I think I lost Justin, or is it internet on my side?
I think I lost Justin too.
Okay, we may have lost Justin. We'll see if he comes back. Oh, Justin, are you back?
I never left. I don't know.
Okay. we did lose you on our side for about 10 seconds or so.
I was just saying, there are some areas to find actual estimates of like the amounts you would convert for Roths. Clearly, you're going to want to double check those, right? Because those are based on estimates of how much you would have in dividends, or how much all sorts of other things would have happened that year. Especially these days when recharacterizations aren't available, you'd want to be pretty sure before you do good, large size Roth conversions.
Yeah, and just from a practical perspective, I'll use like Income Lab for that long-term strategy to dial that in, but then I personally use Holistiplan. I like to jump into that software and like really fine tune based on the client's return and income that we know for the year, to take that shorter term view is how I approach that.
And I know we're up on our last minute, so one last question. This one was received another vote, so I'll throw it out there. This user said, real life has lumpy spending, house remodel, trip to Europe, new car. How does Income Lab take this lumpy spending into account?
Yeah, we call that other or variable expenses, and it's super important. So you put that into the plan as, hey, this is one of our spending goals, one of our lifestyle goals, right? And then the plan will adjust for that.
Which I think is a real power of the total risk guardrails compared to something like the withdrawal rate driven guardrails, where it's assumed to be constant because that just doesn't match reality.
Right. Good point.
All right, guys. Well, hey, we are up on our time. Thanks so much again for a great presentation and for a great Q&A for all of our users. Thank you again for attending and for your great questions today. Just a reminder that at the end of the webinar, you will immediately get the survey to put in your CFP ID, your information, so that way we can make sure you do get your CFP credit, CE credit for attending this webinar. Otherwise, please be on the lookout for our follow-up email with the recording with the recording link. Justin, I know people ask for the slides as well. You and I talking, we can probably add those slides onto that follow-up email as well. And then for our invitations to our webinars coming up next month. All right, Derek, Justin, thanks guys. Hope you all have a wonderful day.